Please welcome to the stage the members of our first panel, The State of Hate in New York, led by Moderator Johnathan Smith, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning and to be joined by this really distinguished panel of leaders and public servants to start this panel this morning. As was mentioned, I work at the U.S. Department of Justice, and one of the things that Attorney General Merrick Garland always likes to remind us at the department and to remind the public is that in 1870, when the Department of Justice was founded, one of the primary missions was to deal with the threat of white supremacist violence that was being brought by the Ku Klux Klan and others against Black Americans who were exercising their constitutional rights. And the sad reality is that 153 years later, hate-motivated violence remains far too prevalent in our country. The FBI just a few weeks ago released updated statistics that show what all of us know, that violence based on race or national origin, on religion, on sexual orientation and gender identity remain far too prevalent all across the country. At the Department of Justice, we are still laser focused on responding to the threat of hate-motivated violence. As we sit here today, my colleagues in the Civil Rights Division are in a courtroom in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, holding a trial for the perpetrator of the horrific Tree of Life synagogue tragedy that took place in that city. As was mentioned earlier, we are also prosecuting the person responsible for the terrible attack in Buffalo at the Top supermarket. And these prosecutions, while critically important, are not sufficient to address the scourge of hate-motivated violence. We have to use all of our tools, all of our levers within government to respond to this threat. And that's why I'm so honored and thrilled to be joined this morning by this great all-star lineup of agency leaders and public servants who are going to talk about how they are using their tools and their resources to deal with the threat of hate and how the state of New York is responding with all of the resources it has available to address this concern. And so you have the lineup of speakers in your program, and I'd probably use the full hour just going through their bios, and so I won't do that, but I will just quickly make sure that you all know who is here with us. So going kind of across the panel, at the other end, we have from the New York State Police, Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel R. Christopher West. Next to him, we have the Division of Human Rights Commissioner Maria L. Imperial. From the New York State Office for Victim Services, Director Elizabeth Cronin. From the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, Commissioner Jackie Bray. And right next to me, we have from our Division of Criminal Justice Services, Commissioner Rossana Rosado. And so, Commissioner Rosado, I want to start with you, partially because you're right next to me, but with the work that you all are doing at DCJS, which, as the audience knows, DCJS supports all facets of the state's criminal justice system, and works to improve the overall quality of the criminal justice system in the state. Can you start this morning by telling us about what your agency is doing to address and report incidents of hate crimes? I know that you all have recently released a report, I believe there's new data that you put online even this morning, that talks about the state of hate in New York State. And so I was wondering if you could start by giving a foundation both about the work that you are doing at DCJS, but also what you have uncovered from the analysis that you and your team have done in this report.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's always great. I don't see Carol. I don't see anybody. Carol Mason, but she knows how much I love John Jay. I'm an alum of John Jay, and I'm also on the foundation board here. So I can't think of a better space to have this conversation with my colleagues in state government. So before I dive into the hate crimes data, I want to share how DCJS is using the resources that you talked about to promote unity within our community. And I mean unity in the community, but also unity among all the different players in the criminal justice system, right? So you have the courts, you have law enforcement, you have communities. So DCJS continues to evolve with the changes, and as we are providing the resources, we're trying to force some of that change. Not that there's a lot of resistance, but there are groups that are not used to working together. So we work with all the stakeholders to bring the resources, the expertise, and information needed for a little more equitable and efficient justice system. I'm proud that we get to work every day with our local partners to keep New Yorkers safe. However, we need to make our communities not just safe, but stronger and resilient. Over the last, several years, we've been dealing with crisis. So we're hoping that this is the year we get to really do preventive, work and help kind of stem, right, the tide of the violence in the future. The persistence of poverty and crime and other, indicators that you know about, are often too common in the neighborhoods that are also faced with violence. So I gotta have my notes because Joe worked hard on them. So last year we toured the state to visit our programs in 7 cities. This year we're doing 15. Thanks to the governor's leadership, we've been able to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in new funding to support our law enforcement agencies and community-based organizations with programs to better address crime, its causes, and its consequences. And these programs include SNUG outreach, the SNUG street outreach, Project Rise to empower communities. We went out to the communities and said, here's $2 million, tell us what to do with it. And it was tough for them, but they're doing it this year. GIVE, which is our gun-involved violence elimination initiative, which focuses on resources for law enforcement, and the Crime Analysis Center, the CAC network. These programs are making a difference, and we're investing more money in them this year. And as we hear on-the-ground partners and see in our recent programs, this year, from last year to this year, we've seen a decrease in shootings. We've also continued our Securing Communities Against Hate Crimes grant program in the most recent budget with another $25 million. These grants help protect our non-for-profit and other organizations at risk of crime, of hate crimes or an attack. And this funding is in addition to the $50 million that we did over the last 3 years. So the data. Okay, so onto the data. I always like to remind people that New York remains the safest large state in the country and incarcerates the fewest people. That is something to be proud of. It took a long time to get there. According to the most recent national statistics, our work is to continue to reduce crime to its all-time lows and ensure all of New York neighborhoods share in this progress. But we do this in part by collecting mountains of data and information. DCJS maintains, analyzes, and publishes criminal and youth justice system data, including reported crime, arrests, and dispositions. Police departments, sheriff's offices, probation departments, and OCA, the State Office of Court Administration, report these data to DCJS. And this data provides policymakers, practitioners, and the public with information on how the criminal justice system is operating in the communities. We're making an extra effort this year to help, to kind of help them interpret it as well, right? Not just posting it up there, but trying to tell the narratives. From our crime reporting, more than 500 police departments and sheriff's offices across the state report crime data to us, which allows us to share a statewide crime picture with you. For hate crimes, we focus on collecting and sharing data on crimes that target people or property based on a perception or belief about race, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, religion, or other characteristics as defined by state law. As we know all too well, these crimes adversely affect entire communities, not just the intended targets. But with that data, we annually publish a hate crimes report on incidents and arrests that we receive from law enforcement. From this report, which is available on our website, we saw that hate crimes increased an alarming 56% in 2021. 773 incidents in 2021 were the most reported statewide in a decade, with significant increases in anti-Asian, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-Jewish crimes. There were significant differences in hate crime trends by region. So in New York City, reports of these crimes increased 89%. In the rest of the state, there was a 14% increase. We're also training law enforcement, on reporting these up. More than half of all reported hate crimes targeted people, and 44% targeted property. Hate crimes against persons, 437, increased 95%, while crimes against property, 336, increased by 24% year to year. Today, we are posting preliminary hate crimes data from 2022 on the DCJS website. You can check that out. This new information shows that hate crimes continue to increase by 20% statewide. It also shows that regionally, hate crimes increased 16% in New York City and 28% outside of New York City. And the increases were driven by more anti-Jewish. There's an uptick of 33%. That's 355 versus 267. And anti-Black. There's an uptick of 37%. That's 164 incidents versus 120. So as well as persistent anti-LGBTQ crimes. At DCJS, justice and safety for all New Yorkers is our mission. We use the data that we discussed today to help inform policy and practice by building upon the evidence-based work, by strengthening police-community relations, and by supporting community and law enforcement partners to reduce crime, save lives, and make the justice system equitable. So I thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and encourage you to check out the data on the DCJS website.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I do think the points you made about really understanding the localized assessment of what hate looks like is critically important, because we all know that communities across the state are different, the threats that they face are different, and having the type of granular data you talked about is, I think, critical, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but also from a community perspective, to know what the threats are and how to effectively respond to that. And I think that's actually a really good segue to the next question. I'm going to go to the end of the panel to Lieutenant Colonel West, to talk about the perspective of the state police, because we know that the state police and law enforcement more generally are on the front lines of responding to hate crimes when they occur. And back in 2018, the state created a hate crimes task force, which is designed to address the increase in bias-motivated threats, harassment, and violence throughout the New York State. And the state police serves as the chair, the head of that task force, along with assistance from DCJS and DHR. And there's even a hotline that the state police operates where people who are impacted by hate crimes can call to get assistance. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the task force works, how you work with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement, how you work with prosecutors, and really how the state police works to have a strong, proactive, and responsive response to acts of hate when they occur across the state.
Okay. Thank you, Johnathan. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having us here today. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak about this very important topic. Let me start by saying the state police, all of our members receive basic training when they go to the academy on hate crime investigations. So all of our troopers and investigators have basic training on hate crimes and things of that nature. So when you have something that happens, trooper comes out and you dial 911 or you make your phone call, trooper comes out, makes an investigation, starts the investigation, I should say, and then from there, a determination is made as to whether or not we have a hate crime or we need to go further. And by go further, I mean we also have an additional 100 members around the state who receive additional training in hate crime investigations so that they can then take the case and go further with it, and that's where we work with our partners, both federal, state, local, and everyone else here on the panel. We work together and try to share information as much as we can to make sure that we do things and get the proper resolution. We also have 2 members that are assigned to NYPD Hate Crimes Task Force, and they're full-time on that front as well. So we also work closely with the city. It's something that we take very seriously, and we're doing a lot of work on, and we want to continue working on it, and we hope that that is a good start.
Great. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. And if I could ask one follow-up question. Obviously, so much of the work that the state police does in this area, involves partnership and engagement with your partners across both the law enforcement and the state government apparatus. Local law enforcement, we're here in New York City, whereas the commissioner just mentioned, there's been a sharp rise in hate crimes, and the NYPD, I'm sure, is a close partner to all of you. And so I was wondering if you could talk about both, kind of how you are working with your law enforcement partners, and then also, oftentimes, and certainly this is something we see at the federal level as well, there may be a call about a hate crime or a hate incident, and it may not rise to the level of a criminal prosecution, that the tools that you have criminally or that prosecutors have may not be, cannot respond to that incident. And so can you talk about how you work with, DHR or the Office of Victim Services in those situations as well, where maybe there's not a law enforcement criminal response, but there's still an act of hate that has occurred and a victim that's looking for redress?
Right, that's a good point that you bring up. Oftentimes we have an incident that may come in, and that's why I mentioned early on that our investigators and all of our troopers receive training, because it's important to be able to kind of vet out some of the things. When something happens to you, you may think it happened to you because of, your race or, sexual orientation or some other thing that happened. But when you drill down into it and look further into it, yeah, there was a crime there, or maybe there wasn't a crime there, but it didn't necessarily have to happen because of that particular thing. So it's very important that we have that. So once we get the initial investigation going, then we can, kind of maybe direct it to the proper agency, because a lot of times you also may not have a crime as you mentioned, but you may have something else that you found during the course of your investigation that may fall under the purview of another agency that they may be able to take, and you may be able to guide them to do that, and it may be something else with one of the other agencies that they can take and be better handled or suited to handle. As the commissioner mentioned earlier about a rise in different numbers and different things like that, like for instance last year we had over 320 and 288 of them were closed by investigation. I mean, they're investigated, but they all didn't turn out to be hate crimes. From that number, we had probably 20, I believe it was, that were actually resulted in arrest for hate crimes, and the others are still under investigation. So it's important that we investigate every single one of these things, but also make sure that they go under the right category.
Thank you. Increasingly when we talk about hate crimes, I think, the situation at the top supermarkets, a good example of, these are not just acts of violence, but they are acts of, I think the term increasingly of domestic terrorism, that they are bringing terror to communities, to individuals. And, one of the things I often know that when we talk about hate crimes, why they're particularly pernicious is that they don't just impact the individual victim, but they impact entire communities, right, who feel like simply because of who you are, what you look like, what you believe, who you love, you may also be targeted. And so, Commissioner Bray, I wanted to turn to you because, as many of us know, last year Governor Hochul signed Executive Order 18, which requires every county and New York City to develop and maintain a domestic terrorism prevention plan, and directed DCJS to establish a unit dedicated to preventing the threat and the scourge of domestic terrorism. And so I was hoping you could talk about the work that you and DCJS are doing in this area and how your agency has prioritized developing a public health approach to preventing extremist violence that we're seeing in the state and around the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Good morning. It's really lovely to be here, and we can't see any of you, so it's sort of cracking me up. It's like there are people out there somewhere. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm particularly glad to be doing this on the week that's the one-year anniversary of the domestic terrorism attack in Buffalo, and I think such a brutal and watershed event for the state, certainly for our agency. Let's talk about domestic violent extremism for a second to sort of ground ourselves. I came to this agency 18 months ago without a background in counterterrorism, and as I was getting briefed up on counterterrorism and the state's work, one thing just sort of kept jumping out at me that I think is important to orient all of our brains. If you look at the type of terror threats that this nation has faced since the late 1990s, there's a real pattern. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, obviously anchored on the awful attacks of September 11th, 2001, the threat of foreign terrorist organizations was primary in the United States. And what you see in the mid-2010s is this rise in what we call homegrown violent extremism, which are largely global jihadist motivated ideological attacks, but from people who live here, who are based here, who are largely what some people call lone wolf. We talk about what that term is and really isn't. And then you see in 2016 and really accelerating in 2018 and 2020, domestic violent extremism take off feels like the wrong word, but eclipse homegrown violent extremism. And domestic violent extremism is violent extremism motivated by domestic ideologies. I'm simplifying, but my brain is simple. And one of the things that is that man does propaganda work. That when you look terror threats based here, that correlates to the rise and the sophistication of English language propaganda from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, largely out of the UK, but not only out of the UK. And when you look at the rise of domestic violent extremists in our current era, that absolutely corresponds to the propaganda that we saw around 2016 and that has continued and accelerated. And we have to, I think, understand what is happening in this country right now around domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism, the intersection with hate crimes and hate and violence as propaganda working. And we have to understand terrorism, as sort of broad a word that is, right now getting driven by two global, fundamentalist, misogynist movements, one of which we're exporting, and one of which has visited us in truly destructive and tragic ways, obviously, for this state over the last 20 years. There you go, math in my head. We have to understand that we now, as a country, are exporting a fundamentalist, violent, misogynist, racist movement. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing about it? And Johnathan, you said, and I think it's really important in this context, that this isn't new for our country, right? I mean, this is our original sin. So what makes this moment new? I mean, we spent a lot of time at Dishes thinking about what makes this moment new, because I think to understand how to respond to the current threat environment, we have to really dig in to understand the current threat environment. And one of the things that makes this moment different than a moment 10 years ago, yeah, math, head again, is that the way people who want to threaten, intimidate, and hurt their fellow Americans are organized is a real threat to democracy. And they're doing it on purpose to threaten democracy. And that has happened before in this country, right? In the entire antebellum history of this country, certainly in the Civil War, certainly around Jim Crow. But at least in my lifetime, I'm not that old, it has not been such a threat to democracy and liberty as it is today from an institutional perspective. And so our response, and that is terrifying as an American. I don't know about all of you, there are times I've woken up in the last 5 or 6 years and been terrified for my country, our country. But it also offers us an opportunity, because the ways you fight and prevent terrorism are different if you understand the end game and the goal of the terrorism. So for our agency at Dishes, I'm sure there are stats that my team gave me that I'm failing to say, but for our agency at Dishes, what that has meant over the last year, it's a horrible acronym, I'm sorry, Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, is that we stood up the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Unit, and we stood up a unit that was going to be expressly focused on prevention. We're pretty good at boom and right of boom. So if you think about an attack or any type of disaster, you think left of boom is before it, boom is during it, right of boom is after it. Well, we're great at boom and right of boom. We got really good at that. But what we decided to do, honestly based on what the feds have been doing for decades, is to try to really invest in left of boom. And we're doing that in a couple different ways. The first thing that we're doing, thanks to Governor Hochul, is investing $10 million a year specifically in counties and New York City to say you have to have a domestic terrorism prevention plan. You have to orient your resources around this threat. The way you spent money after 9/11 in Homeland Security cannot be the way you spend money today. So give us a plan and tell us how you're going to change the way you're spending money to be current to your current threat. We're investing in what we call threat assessment and management teams. These are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams. This is what Johnathan was referring to as a public health approach, that work together when someone is radicalizing, not yet motivated to violence, but radicalizing. Maybe they haven't triggered law enforcement yet. Maybe law enforcement's hands are tied. They haven't committed a crime. This is the United States. We have rights. We have liberties. We want to protect those. We don't want to infringe on those. But they're radicalizing, and the people around them know that they're radicalizing and don't know who to go to for help. And these threat assessment and management teams are designed to help intervene with all of the capacity of local government, not just a law enforcement response, and really explicitly not just a law enforcement response, law enforcement when we need it, but not at the jump. We're investing in trainings on how we identify radicalization, understand radicalization in our families, in our workplaces, in our schools, out at the bar at night, so that it's not just my crazy uncle, it's a real problem and I can do something about it, right? And we've released something that we've called our targeted violence prevention strategy. I'm sure it is on our website. I have no idea what the link is, but that lays out this plan that says, here's how we're going to invest. And the bad news is that domestic violent extremism is the #1 most persistent and legal threat to the United States, to New Yorkers right now, when it comes to terrorist threats. The bad news is that New York is #2, with the latest data we have is 2020, and we're #2, behind only California for the number of attacks and plots. But the good news is that every single one of us can intervene, that every single one of us has a role to play. And what DISHES is really trying to do through the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Team and Unit is give New Yorkers of all walks of life, not just our law enforcement colleagues, and we love our law enforcement colleagues, the tools and the skills and the information that they need, that you need to intervene. So we're very proud of the work we've done. We're in the infancy of this. I always say that, you can't count the dogs that don't bark. So every failure that our agency, that our state has is going to be front page news. None of the saves are were we ever going to speak about. But it's a frightening time, but it's also a time of opportunity. And I hope today we welcome other people into that work.
Thank you, Commissioner. And you said a number of really important things there, but I think the point you made about thinking about how we use the full range of tools, not just law enforcement, to think about how we prevent, whether it's domestic terrorism, whether it's hate crimes, whether it's violence more generally, is critically important. And if we have more time, I'd love to come back to this topic of how you all and how the state is thinking about public health and these other interventions as ways to, prevent, identify, and provide the services and support that people need to, not only prevent these boom things from happening, but also making sure that people just get the services that they need to live productive and safe lives. So really important. I wanted to turn now to Commissioner Imperial from the Division of Human Rights. You get applause even before you've answered the question. Exactly. So as you know, and as presumably the audience knows, Governor Hochul has tasked the Division of Human Rights with creating a hate and bias prevention unit. And I think it really kind of flows with what Commissioner Bray was talking about. How does the state, how does government intervene before the state police needs to get involved, before an act of violence has occurred? And this hate and prevention unit is, I think, another critical piece of that puzzle, or of that solution. And so if you could talk about the work that DHR has done in creating this unit and how it fits into the broader mission of the agency, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Johnathan. And yes, Commissioner Bray and I both got the same memo. But before I start talking about the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit, I think it's important for everybody to know the beautiful mission of the State Division of Human Rights. And our mission is to eliminate discrimination, remedy injustice, and to promote equal opportunity, access, and dignity. And I think the coda of that mission is the most important because it recognizes our common humanity. And our vision is a New York State where everyone could fulfill their potential and where everyone could participate fully in the life of the state. Before I came to the State Division, I was not aware that New York State was actually the first state in the country to pass a human rights law, and it's something that I'm very proud of. Also was the first state to set up a state agency to enforce the law. So before I speak about the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit, I want to talk about how the State Division historically has been dealing with discrimination. And the way that we've been dealing with discrimination is that we investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate discrimination complaints. Now, this is after the fact. Each year we get about 6,000 complaints. The majority are related to workplace, mostly have to do with employment issues. And actually, the largest percentage of the basis of discrimination is disability, followed by race and color. So in addition to having individuals bring complaints, we also have a really important tool that's the Division-Initiated Action Unit, where we actually have a unit, and the two people that run the unit are here in the audience. I'll give them a shout out. And the Division-Initiated Action Unit is able to bring a complaint on behalf of the state where we want to see systemic change. And so one of the areas where we have brought Division-Initiated complaints is in the area of school bullying. And so we've been able to intervene by bringing a complaint and having school districts change their policies because of the complaint. Now, when the governor tasked us with creating this hate and bias prevention unit, I was so thrilled because, as I mentioned, the majority of what we were doing is after the fact, after somebody has experienced discrimination. And so as I was listening to Commissioner Bray, I feel like our approach is very similar in that now the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit will give us the opportunity to work on prevention, and also it's multidisciplinary and it's also very community-centric. So under the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit, we have 4 pillars. The first pillar is the creation of the regional councils, and I know the governor announced that as part of her remarks. Very grateful to the people who have come, who are part of the regional council, who are here with us today. And so before we set up the regional councils, we actually went across the state and did a listening tour because we wanted to hear from each region as to how they're experiencing, how you're experiencing hate across the state. And it was very informative, and increasingly we heard that people needed resources, people wanted to work together, break down silos, and we also heard that it was very important to bring youth voice into our movement. So we're setting up the regional councils, then we're also creating a rapid response team where we will have staff at DHR who will be working in collaboration with the regional councils and will be able to respond to a hate incident, a hate or bias incident. And our approach, we're actually going to be taking a restorative justice approach. So one of the things that we'll be offering might be a healing circle. I feel like it's a very important part of our work. So I mentioned that we also heard that it was important to bring youth voice into this work. And so we're also going to be creating a youth initiative as part of this work as a pilot to try to have youth become ambassadors for love as opposed to being influenced by the propaganda of hate. And then the fourth pillar is actually we've been tasked with creating a public campaign. Again, just the way there could be propaganda for hate, the public service campaign is going to be a campaign for love. And so we're very excited about starting the work, kicking off the work. We're going to be going across the state the following week, starting our regional councils. And I think it's important to also stress what our role is. We see our role really as facilitators, meaning that I keep on coming back to a cooking analogy that we're setting the table and hoping to give you tools because you're really the experts. We have to listen to you. You're the trusted people in the community. And so we want to be able to bring you resources, to facilitate trainings, but ultimately you are the ones with the answers and you are the ones that we want to be supporting.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think the work that DHR does is so critically important. At the Department of Justice, we often talk about hate crimes, which are acts of violence that merit a criminal response, but also hate incidents, which are acts of hate which may not rise to the level of a criminal prosecution, but yet are still inflicting harms on individuals and communities. And as you alluded to, we know that these hate incidents are often taking place in schools, in workplaces, in communities. And so thinking about how we use the full range of tools, whether that's civil legal authorities, like the ones like the New York State human rights law, whether that's using restorative justice tools, like you mentioned, whether that's education, all of that's critically important to thinking about how we address these hate incidents, which are horrific in and of themselves, but also we know that these hate incidents, if they're not controlled or contained or addressed, lead to the type of hate crimes oftentimes that we read about and see taking place across the state and across the country. So the work you all are doing is so critically important. We've talked a lot about numbers and statistics, but it's important to remember that behind each of those numbers is a person, is a victim. It's someone who is impacted by hate in their lives or in their family. And so, Director Cronin, I wanted to turn to you as the Director of the Office of Victim Services to talk about the critical work and services that you provide and support that you provide to crime victims and their families, including, relevant to this conversation, victims of hate crimes. And can you give an overview of the work that OVS does in this space and how you all are working to support those victims as they seek to recover from acts of hate?
Sure. Thanks so much, Johnathan, and thanks, Commissioner Imperial, for inviting OVS. We're sort of the little agency that could. We're small, but we're mighty. And thank you. And, what I have found is that people don't want to think about being the victim of a crime. And so when we are out in the communities sort of talking about who we are and what we do, people say, yeah, but they just turn away because we don't want to think that that may happen to us or someone that we care about. And so, we continually try to keep the message going that we are there for you. This is an agency, is under the governor that is a safety net for victims of crime and survivors, so that if the time comes where they need the services, that we are always going to be there. So we have a three-part mission. We fund well over 200 victim assistance programs throughout the state. We cover all regions of the state. We provide financial compensation reimbursement to eligible victims of crime. And then we advocate on behalf of victims, and whether that's proposing policy or it's crafting legislation. We are involved in looking at, what aren't we doing, what are people needing, and how can we do a better job assisting victims. And for example, when I was listening to you talk about what the state police is doing, we fund advocates in many of the state police barracks, so that people who are the victim of a hate crime, for example, and do report it to the police, or through circumstances it ends up being reported to the police, they have someone there beside a police officer, which can feel very intimidating to people, who can assist them to sort of navigate them through the process, which is really important. And that's one of the things that we have found in this arena, is that victims may be afraid to report. So let's say they're an immigrant or a refugee, or they're undocumented, or they're an LGBTQ who has had difficulty in the system before, or they're not out to their families, or whatever the reasons are behind why somebody might be disinclined to get involved in the system. There's a whole other avenue for them to explore, which is to go to one of our advocates and get help and information and services from them, and then they can make a decision about how they want to proceed, which is really important. We started collecting data about hate crimes a few years ago, and the information we have is about 3 to 4% are reported as hate crimes. I'm sure that it's much higher, but people are not, those are cases that are not coming to us, or they're not being reported. So we are in the midst right now of a very comprehensive statewide needs assessment to try to suss out, what is happening out in our communities. And like Commissioner Bray talked about, this is the 1 year, it's incredible, on Sunday, the 1 year anniversary of the Buffalo massacre, which we responded to with Homeland Security. And one thing that I have found in the time that I've been on this job is that we, as state agencies, and with our allied partners, need to really be in constant communication with each other and working together in ways to address these really complicated, multi-layered situations. So, as you talked about in Buffalo, this devastated not just the families of those who were directly involved, but this entire community. I mean, there were people in that community who did not emerge from their homes for months and months and months, understandably, because they feel they're a target. And so, all of the systems that were there for the people in that community broke down because TOPS was sort of the center of a lot of daily activity. And so, we collaborated in a way to try to reestablish a lot of those services and help people get back on their feet. And, one of the things that when you were talking about domestic violent extremists, the words that were ringing in my ear was domestic violence, because we fund, like 42% of our funding goes to domestic violence and sexual assault programs, and statistically, many of these violent extremists also have a history of domestic violence in their lives, and so it's really important for all of us to be constantly communicating about those issues, so that if we're going to do prevention, it's watching what's happening on a very local level to see if that is something that is going to escalate into something really unspeakable. So, I mean, we can do with hate crimes, we have responded to any number of them, and it can be anything from paying for funeral expenses, for example, but it can be relocating a family. So we worked with a family in Buffalo that just had too many ties. It was too devastating for them, and we assisted them in leaving the community and reestablishing a life somewhere else. And as much as they didn't want to go, they felt it was important for the safety of their family. We can help with, funding painting over swastikas on someone's garage. I mean, it can be from very small projects to much larger projects. And I think the message that I want to leave with people is that people who experience hate crimes are not alone, and that, if there's one portal into the system that they don't want to avail themselves of at any given time, there are other portals that they can go through to get help and support, and that there are a lot of resources. This governor is clearly committed to this issue and has galvanized all of us, to think, how can we work together on things and like enhance programs that are already being done, or because I worked with Human Rights Commission, we reached out to the Office of New Americans, how can we reach refugees and immigrants better? If we work together on all of these issues and bring in all the members of the community, then we're going to be a lot stronger and smarter in the response that we give to these victims.
Thank you, Director Cronin. When you were talking, I reflected on a few months ago, I had the opportunity to visit the site in Buffalo, and you mentioned just the trauma, the understandable trauma on communities and the fear that so many residents had, even if they were not there that day, of going out, of being a victim. But I also, when I was there, I also remember hearing from community members who talked about, when that happened, the supermarket closed. And there was also just the trauma of, that was where many people in that community go get their food. And how do you just manage your household, your meal preparation. And so the way that victims suffer, the services that people need really run the gamut, right? From emotional, psychological support to really basic needs and ways in which communities and communal life could be disrupted, when an incident like this happens in a community. And so the work that you all do is, again, critically important and a good reminder of the range of services and supports that you provide to communities and to victims is, I think, important for all of us to remember. We just have a few minutes left, but in the last few minutes, I wanted to open up to the entire panel with a few quick questions. And the first is, and again, this is something Director Cronin, you touched upon, is so much of reporting of hate crimes or hate incidents involves trust, right? If communities don't trust law enforcement, if they don't trust government, if they don't trust any of the agencies represented up here, then they're not going to feel comfortable coming forward, reporting what has happened to them. They're not going to feel comfortable putting their faith in our agencies to respond meaningfully and effectively to the challenges that they're facing. And so I wonder if any of you could talk about how you have, if you've experienced that challenge of building and maintaining trust with victims, with communities, with historically marginalized populations, and how you have worked to overcome that. Are there lessons that you think all of us, in government or beyond, should think about how we can do that work more effectively?
Well, one of the projects I'm most proud of is our collaboration with DCJS. So Rossana, Commissioner Rosado was talking about the GIVE program, and they have the street outreach program embedded within there called SNUG. And we started working with the SNUG teams in 2014, I think, to train them on our work because they are trusted messengers in those communities. And so we ended up providing a significant amount of funding to DCJS to hire case managers and social workers in those SNUG sites because we saw that people in those communities were not coming to our regularly funded programs, but we knew there was crime. And so that has been pretty wildly successful where victims of all types, domestic violence, sexual assault, are going to these case managers. And then what we found is when we went to Buffalo, there is a very excellent SNUG program in Buffalo. They have the trust of the community, so we were able to kind of ease our way in to providing services because that was an organization within that community that had the trust. So I think for us, it's about identifying who in those communities. So we've added people to our advisory council from different communities across the state because they tell us, how can we do things in a way that invites people to come in and get services.
Commissioner Rosado.
Yes, I would like to add up. So I think this is really important for this conference today and for all of you who are here. I think as we define hate, I think it's important to recognize that there's a large segment of our community, not just in New York, in the country, immigrants, people of color. We're so used to being mistreated that it's hard to recognize hate and sometimes to define it. And that's why we come across these issues with law enforcement or the credibility. We heard the stats about how many cases are reported. And it's hard sometimes for people to understand what is racism and what is hate. What is discrimination, what is bullying, and what is hate. And so I think we need to do a better job of defining that. We had a meeting back when you were with us. We had a meeting with some people in the diplomatic community, some consuls, and they turned to us and they said, well, where does free speech end and hate begin, right? And so with our American brains, we see it. We say, we know what a hate crime is, but most people don't. And so I think we need to work collaboratively on definitions, on saying to people, yeah, you draw the line here, right? That again, when you're used to being discriminated against because you speak differently or you look differently, you kind of, you let it bounce off of you. But here, we have an opportunity to stem, right, hate, prevent future crimes. And I just think we have to work on better definitions so that people understand that you don't have to be mistreated at work or in your community, and that when you report it to people in government, to people in law enforcement, that we take that seriously. So I just wanted to make that point today.
I agree so much with what Commissioner Rosado said, and we spoke with LA vs. Hate. They just launched an initiative, public service campaign, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but for me, if we have more hate and bias reporting, that's a good thing, because it means that people trust us to come forward. And when we spoke with people at LA vs. Hate, they told us that they've seen a 30% increase in hate crime and bias incidents. But they said that, again, that it was a good thing because exactly what Commissioner Rosado said, that they're realizing now the treatment that they've felt for years, that it's no longer normalized. And so that now they know that, that they have a right to experience and participate fully in the life of the state without being mistreated or experiencing hate. So the reporting has gone up, but again, people are feeling better about that hate isn't being normalized.
We always get a lot of applause. I think the commissioner hit on something when she said trust. And reporting and trust. And I think when people trust you, they talk to you. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, I know people have been seeing us a lot more. They've been telling us they've been seeing us a lot more. We've been out recruiting, but not only recruiting, out into communities, and in communities talking and hearing and listening to people. And when you listen to people, you understand what they want, what they need. A lot of communities don't have someone like me that's in this position. So it's important for me and others to get out there and show people and let them know that, you see it, you can be it. But also, you establish that trust and that relationship so that the first time they see you, it isn't when you're getting a ticket or you have some other traumatic event or some hate crime or some other thing that's happened to you. But they feel more comfortable coming to you and reporting to you when they have been around you and see you more as a person and things like that. So I think that's one of the things that we've all been trying to do, is just trying to maybe see a little, not necessarily the softer side, but the real side. And hopefully we can work on that and we can all be better and be better for it. But that's one of the things that I know personally I want to do, and just reach out into our communities and just be out there more, be present more, and just really be helpful.
So we're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask one final question, and I'm going to ask each of you to respond with just one sentence, which is probably a recipe for disaster, but we're going to try it. So we have in the audience community leaders, faith leaders, we have students, we have a good cross-section of this great city, of this great state, and if there's one sentence, just one sentence that you want them to take away about the work that your agency is doing, what would that sentence be? And maybe I'll start with you, Commissioner Rosado, not to put you on the spot, and we could just go down the road.
I guess my sentence would be, we work for you.
Can Elizabeth go?
I'm a lawyer, one sentence is impossible, but it's a comma, but we recognize the seriousness of hate crimes, and we are here to support you.
Similar message. We have to listen to you better, and listen and respect and be humble and put into action what your ideas.
Commissioner, I think we talked backstage about working for you. I think you stole that one from me. No. Actually, I was going to steal that from her. If it started with me, I was going to stay at it. But I would just say, work together. That's one thing that no matter, what rank you are, or what color you are, what agency, if we work together, I think we can move mountains.
No pressure, but you are standing between this good audience and lunch, so.
If you had asked me 10 years ago if this would ever be true, I would laugh. The fight of our generation has turned out to be one against a violent authoritarianism, and the rise in hate crimes is connected to that, and into the breach we go. We have no option but to use every tool at our disposal to fight it and maintain our liberties and our democracy.
That wasn't a sentence. That wasn't one sentence, but I'll allow it. It was a semicolon. Well, I could stay here all day, but apparently I'm not allowed to do that. So if you will just join me in giving a round of applause to all of our state leaders, and I just want to thank all of you for the work that you all do and that your agencies and your staff do each and every day to keep all of us safe and secure and to fight against hate. We are a better state and a better country because of it. So thank you, and thank you all for being with us.